The year is 1075, and inside the Grand Palace of Venice, something is dying. Not just dying, rotting. The richest men in the Republic, merchants who've sailed treacherous seas, nobles who've witnessed plague and war are fleeing the building with silk handkerchiefs pressed desperately against their faces. Their eyes stream with tears. Some vomit in the marble corridors. Others abandon centuries of protocol and simply run, gasping for air that doesn't carry the unspeakable stench drifting down from the royal apartments above. The enemy isn't an invading army or a political conspiracy. It's a smell so vile, so impossibly foul, that it threatens to paralyze the entire Venetian government. And at the center of this nightmare lies a Byzantine princess named Theodora Duchina, trapped in her own body as it betrays her in ways no medieval physician can comprehend or stop. Theodora arrived in Venice in 1075 as a bride from Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, a city so advanced it made Western Europe look primitive by comparison. While Venetians lived on muddy islands among fishermen's huts and merchant warehouses, Constantinople boasted running water, carved marble palaces, dazzling mosaics, and libraries filled with ancient wisdom. Theodora carried that world with her, and from the moment she stepped into the Doge's palace, she unsettled everyone she met. She wasn't the first Byzantine princess to scandalize Venice. 70 years earlier, Maria Argyropolona had shocked the city with her foreign customs, and chroniclers were still gossiping about her decades later. But Theodora would become something far more terrifying than a cultural curiosity. She would become a legend of decay, a mystery that would haunt Venice for centuries. The scandal began at her first Venetian banquet. Theodora sat radiant in shimmering silks, her jewels catching the firelight like trapped stars. Then she raised a small golden utensil, 2 delicate prongs on an ornate handle, and used it to lift food to her lips without touching it with her fingers. The hall froze. Hardened merchants and diplomats watched in horrified silence as this foreign princess refused to eat like a normal person. To Byzantines, the fork was civilized. To Venetians in 1075, it looked disturbingly like the devil's pitchfork, and the woman using it seemed to think herself too holy to touch food with her God-given hands. Priests muttered that such pride was an invitation for divine judgment. They had no idea how prophetic those words would become. But the fork was only the beginning of Theodora's assault on Venetian sensibilities. While locals bathed rarely, fearing frequent washing weakened the body, Theodora demanded elaborate baths using rainwater collected in ornate vessels. She refused the public bathhouses, considering them beneath her Byzantine dignity. Her chambers burned constantly with incense and exotic herbs, filling the palace corridors with scents no Venetian had ever encountered. She wore gloves dusted with perfume, introduced finger bowls and napkins, and burned candles that glowed brighter and cleaner than anything Venice had known. To her, these were basic comforts of civilization. To the Venetians, it felt like an invasion, because in 1075, Venice was a city at war with stench. Unwashed bodies, fish guts rotting in the canals, animal waste in the streets. The smell of decay was everywhere. The wealthy carried small bouquets called nosegays just to survive the odor of daily life. And here was Theodora, not masking smells but erasing them entirely, replacing Venice's familiar filth with fragrances that seemed unnatural, almost otherworldly. Inside the palace, Theodora recreated the imperial court of Constantinople itself. She surrounded herself with ladies-in-waiting chamberlains and pages arranged in elaborate Byzantine hierarchy. Where Venetians expected informal gatherings, Theodora demanded ceremony and reverence. Her clothing left observers speechless. Silks so fine they shimmered like water, threaded with gold and encrusted with gems that caught light until she seemed to glow. Her meals became theatrical performances served on pure gold plates and crystal vessels, course after course presented as though eating were an art form. For Venetians accustomed to scooping food with their fingers from wooden bowls, the sight was staggering. But what truly unsettled them was Theodora's complete lack of shame. She didn't apologize for her Byzantine ways or temper her tastes. To her cultured mind, luxury wasn't sin but civilization, proof of human brilliance and refinement. The Venetians, however, saw something rotten beneath all that gold. The city began splitting into factions. Some women started imitating Theodora's style, powdering their faces and perfuming their sleeves. Merchants raced to import Byzantine luxuries, smelling profit in crystal and scented oils. But resistance hardened just as quickly. Preachers thundered that foreign decadence would damn the Republic, that Venice's strength came from humility and tradition, not Eastern excess. The tension grew like a crack in the foundation of the palace itself. And then, without warning, disease struck. The change started small. Servants noticed Theodora's elaborate morning rituals growing shorter, less frequent. The incense in her chambers burned less often. She seemed tired, distracted. Nothing alarming at first, just the strain of adjusting to a foreign city in a political marriage. But within weeks, something began happening to her body. Something the physicians of 1075 had no framework to understand. It would start as whispers of illness and end as a horror so profound that chroniclers would struggle to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. The first undeniable sign was the smell. Not her usual perfumes and incense, but something else entirely. Something darker, heavier, organic, something that seemed almost alive. At first, Palace officials blamed the drainage system or spoiled food in the kitchens. Easy explanations for an unpleasant odor. But days passed and the smell only intensified, sinking into the very stone of the building. Servants who had spent their entire lives in medieval Venice, who had endured every kind of filth the city could produce, now gagged when they approached Theodora's chambers. Veterans of disease-ridden alleys and foul marketplaces turned pale and stumbled out retching. The exotic perfumes and costly incense that once symbolized refinement became powerless against the stench seeping from her rooms, and Theodora knew it. The Byzantine princess who had once commanded all with her grace now felt her own body betraying her in the most humiliating way imaginable. Physicians trained in Constantinople arrived, armed with confidence in ancient remedies. They tried bloodletting herbal concoctions, dietary restrictions, prayers whispered over her bed. Nothing worked. Nothing even slowed whatever force was tearing her apart from within. Life inside the palace fractured. Servants stopped entering her chamber entirely, developing a grim ritual of leaving food and linens at her door before retreating quickly with perfumed cloths pressed to their faces. Even the most loyal attendants whispered prayers under their breath, not from devotion but from fear that her fate might somehow spread to them. Theodora's husband, Doge Domenico Selvo, found himself trapped in an impossible situation. He had married her for politics, to strengthen ties between Venice and the Byzantine Empire. But in time he'd grown to respect her brilliance and foreign elegance. Now that same elegance was decaying before his eyes, while the entire republic watched his every move. If he abandoned her, he'd lose face and honor. If he stood by her, he risked his court, his alliances, his city's reputation. The physicians grew desperate, prodding her with increasingly bizarre theories. They claimed her Byzantine customs had corrupted her body, that her perfumes and rituals had somehow reacted with Venice's salty lagoon air to poison her from within. But soon even these learned men couldn't bear to remain in her presence. The stench had grown so overpowering it clung to anyone who entered, saturating their clothes and hair. Servants said the odor was seeping into her bedding, her furniture, even the stone walls themselves, as though the palace were absorbing her decay. And through it all, Theodora remained conscious. That may have been the cruelest aspect of her ordeal. No merciful fever took her mind. No delirium offered escape. She remained fully aware, trapped inside a rotting body, forced to watch attendants recoil at the sight of her, to see the horror and pity in their eyes. The princess who had arrived surrounded by ceremony and reverence now had only one or two attendants brave enough to care for her, and even they couldn't endure for long. If you're drawn to these dark corners of history, these forgotten stories that reveal how fragile human dignity can be, please subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what happened to Theodora Ducina matters not just as historical curiosity but as a reminder of how quickly beauty, power and life itself can transform into something unrecognizable. And her story isn't finished yet. Venice spared no expense searching for a cure. Physicians were summoned from across the Mediterranean, from Greece, Arabia, Italy. Strange remedies flooded her bedside. Powdered minerals, exotic animal parts, potions mixed with substances so rare they bordered on mythical. Some healers performed rituals as though her condition was sorcery rather than disease, but nothing helped. Each failed attempt left her weaker, sicker, and more humiliated. The political consequences tightened like a noose. Venice's growing maritime empire depended on trade and alliance with Constantinople. If word spread that the Byzantine bride was cursed or punished by God, the scandal could shatter everything. But palace walls couldn't contain the whispers. Servants fled carrying stories. Merchants passed rumors along the canals. Nobles spread tales to their estates. And with each retelling, the truth mutated into something darker until all of Venice believed that what stalked Theodora was untillness at all but divine judgment for her pride and foreign excess. The final week surpassed any previous horror. The stench seemed to take on a life of its own, saturating everything, as though the palace itself were rotting from within. Physicians wrote frantic notes describing colors and textures of decaying flesh they had no words to name. Some claimed her body was breaking down from the inside out while she remained awake and aware, conscious through every moment of her own decomposition. Imagine that level of suffering, fully alert as your body betrays you inch by inch, hour by hour, while the world recoils in disgust. The smell drifted beyond the palace walls, down city streets, across markets and harbors. Venetians began avoiding entire districts. Merchants complained that stored goods were ruined by proximity alone. Even the air itself seemed corrupted. Yet through it all, two nameless servants endured. Only they remained at Theodora's side in those final weeks, returning again and again when everyone else fled. Their names are lost to history, but their courage left whispers that echo still. In 1083, death finally came as both release and mercy. Palace officials faced an unprecedented crisis in handling her remains. Traditional Byzantine funeral rites had to be abandoned. Instead, Doge Domenico authorized the immediate sealing of Theodora's chambers, transforming them into a tomb within the palace itself. Venetian craftsmen worked in desperate shifts, wearing cloth masks soaked in vinegar and aromatic oils, yet even brief exposure left them gagging. The very tools they used seemed to corrode faster than normal. Mortar said strangely, every moment of the construction felt touched by the same unnatural force that had claimed the princess. Even after death, Theodora's story refused to fade. Venice rebuilt around those sealed chambers, but whispers haunted the palace for generations. Scholars debated endlessly. Was it exotic poison, a rare genetic condition from centuries of Byzantine royal intermarriage, divine punishment for defying God's natural order, or simply a medieval medical mystery that claimed its victim before science could name it? We'll never know with certainty. What we do know is that Theodora Duchina Selvo, who arrived in Venice as a symbol of Byzantine grace and civilization, became something else entirely, a legend of decay, a warning about the collision of cultures and the fragility of human flesh, and a mystery that still unsettles us nearly 1,000 years later. Her extraordinarily sophisticated life ended in unimaginable isolation, her body becoming a horror that drove away everyone except her loyal servants whose names history forgot to preserve. What do you think really happened to the Byzantine princess? Was it disease, poison, divine judgment, or something medicine still can't fully explain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because mysteries like this remind us that even in our modern age, there are still shadows in history that resist the light.